This is Glenn.
Hey Glenn, thanks for coming. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started then since it's 2:01 and it's a beautiful day here. I don't know about where y'all are, but I really would like to get through this. So let me, Mike or Brian, if you can advance the slide one, let me go ahead and get us rolling here. Great. So I'm going to start out. We're going to talk update you briefly on a couple of meetings that have happened recently. Yesterday we had the National Advisory Committee meeting in Washington. Glenn and I were there. So Glenn, feel free to jump in if you have anything to say about that meeting. Mike was on the phone, and Bob Byrne was there as well. So we had lots of people talking about a variety of things, and then I'm going to let Mike update us a little bit on what's going on in our counterpart, the Model Design Work Group, and then what we really want to talk about today is the Delphi panel weightings. So Mike has been working hard to put together a proposal for us of how to go about doing this. Glenn and I have, of course, looked through it a number of times and made some comments and suggestions, and so we'd like to hear from you all as well on this. And I think the next slide, Mike, or not? Yep, let's go back. So let me start with the National Advisory Committee meeting yesterday. We met in Washington, and I probably should have the list of people who were there in front of me. I apologize, I don't. It was most of the National Advisory Committee, which, Glenn, I think you've sent that list around before. Is that right?
Yes, that should be widely available. It's really a great group. I think we were missed. We had all but two of our members, so great.
Yeah. So we sort of stepped them through where the work groups were. I talked about the stuff our group had been doing in terms of the reweighting and in terms of talking about a Delphi approach. And I think there was general support for that among that group to think carefully about the weightings and exactly how to put the index together. There was some good discussion at the beginning of the meeting about the goals and purpose of the index. And then the end of the meeting was about dissemination of the index. Glenn, do you want to add anything to that, or Mike?
I think that's a great summary, Chris. I would just say, overall, my definite sense was there was a lot of support for the overall direction that this work group has helped us craft in terms of updating and enhancing methodology, the scaling and weighting approaches that we've talked about, the Delphi. So I think we got some good, it was a nice opportunity to check in about the overall strategy that we're developing around enhancements, and a lot of support, and also feedback after me. We got some great email this morning from Nikki Lurie, Assistant Secretary for Planning and for Preparedness and Response, just further reinforcing the direction we're going in terms of with methodology especially.
And then, Mike, did you want to update us on what the Model Design Work Group's been doing?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I sent an email out to both the Model Design Work Group and this work group on Friday, May 22nd, and that's basically where we are. What that email was about was the development of a strategic work plan, really so that we could guide the work of the Model Design Group. And we're really, and some of this came up yesterday in the NAC meeting, we're interested in understanding how the index fits within the sort of the wider ecosystem of national frameworks that deal either centrally or on the periphery of the very same topics that, that the index deals with. And I think that, my takeaway from what I heard yesterday and from what I've heard, we had a PMO meeting a couple of weeks ago that included the work group chairs and some other folks, was that while there are a lot of frameworks out there, the prior work groups really focused on many of those, and so the index already reflects to a large extent the existing frameworks, but there are two that really need a careful re-examination, and one is the ASPR National Health Security Strategy, and the other is the RWJ Culture of Health. And so I think that the Model Design Work Group will probably be focusing its efforts on understanding the relationship between the index and its various domains, subdomains, and measures, and the themes and their analogous structures contained in those other two national frameworks. The second area is to identify measures within new measures to implement for the next iteration of the index in four broad areas, and that is within looking at specific measures of intersectoral collaboration and community engagement that are currently in the RWJ Culture of Health measures, possibly some joint commission measures having to do with emergency management accreditation. A third area has to do with some measures of social, economic, environmental, and infrastructure preparedness in a National Institute of Standards and Technology report. And then finally, some measures that deal with work site and occupational health and preparedness. And by the way, I'm going to send an email to Chris Nelson, the chair of the Model Design Work Group, and really, I think that the conversation that you all are going to be having today about weighting is something that the Model Design members need to weigh in on as well, pun intended.
Thanks, Mike. So let's go ahead and advance it one slide, please. Okay, so I hope you all received the email with the outline of the sort of the weighting the Delphi weighting approach that we've put together, and we'll have some slides on that today. Basically, what we're sort of thinking is a 3-iteration Delphi approach. It's very common in the Delphi approach to do sort of multiple iterations, and in particular, given the hierarchical structure of the subdomains and the domains moving into the index, having that as a following that hierarchical structure seemed to make a fair amount of sense to us in terms of structuring the Delphi approach. So we sort of envision a 3-iteration process where in the first iteration we look at measures and how they fit into the subdomain. In the second iteration we look at subdomains and how they fit into the domains, and then in the third iteration the domains and how they fit into the final index. And we're, after talking with the group last time and discussing this here in Kentucky, we think that for now we're going to stick with the all hazards approach. I think I know a number of you, Erica, I think, has been one who has talked about a variety of ways we could do sort of a specific hazards, but there seems to be some consensus that, and I got this out of the National Advisory Committee yesterday too, that we sort of want a cross-cutting all hazards approach. And in particular, I think there's a sense in which we want really in part to be able to identify sort of core factors that cut across different types of hazards as being important to important to the health security preparedness. Next slide, I think. Yeah. So the idea we think will be to get together groups and we'll begin with the groups structuring looking specifically at the individual measures, but we want to group them either by subdomain or by domain. And that's one of the questions that we'll ask. And so get together a panel of experts. So sort of in an ideal world, we might do a panel of experts for each subdomain, looking at the measures in that subdomain and asking, and we sort of think that the kind of question you can see on there, and an example is in the handout that we sent around, asking for how well the measure corresponds to the health surveillance and to the particular subdomain. Then we would take all of those and analyze them and arrive at a set of weights. And I think we're envisioning that we take some sort of an average or a median, which is typically what's done in a Delphi approach. Next slide, please.
Chris, this is James. I have a quick question.
Sure, please.
Based on that. When you put the expert panel together, do you have a sense in terms of composition as to if we want equal practitioners versus academic or content experts? Because I think that if not, then I think you at least need to ask as a variable like where you're coming from in terms of providing advice, because I think meeting the practitioner and academic goals have sort of been something that's done in tandem, and if the perceptions are opposite in terms of the importance, I think that's a conversation that then the model group may need to have in terms of sorting out if there is divergence on a certain measure, which way do we lean?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I don't know that I had thought quite that far along yet, but I think that's a really good point, and certainly one we definitely should take care of. I like your idea of sort of asking them whether they're practitioners or more academics, and then using that in how we do the analysis and how we arrive at the weights. I think that I think that's a good idea, and I think that we had envisioned in terms of the structure of the panel that it would cut across not only practitioners but also subject area experts quite broadly. That there are important perspectives that each group brings that need to be carefully considered, and I think that was kind of our vision, was to gather across a very broad group, and so I think we can probably add that to our other questions section that you see at the top of this current slide.
Can I ask a quick question? This is Julie Ivy.
Julie,
I was wondering, are you consider other measures besides the mean and the median, like to capture variability, like in case, say, there's like a bimodal response, maybe corresponding to the earlier question, that might end up looking like the middle value?
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes the average is not representative of anything, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have. I think to some degree, I think we need to get the data before I can answer exactly how we're going to construct up the weights, because I'm very sympathetic to your point, right? Is that suppose you have a very bimodal distribution, then how do you handle it? Do you take the mean? Do you take the median, or do we do something else? And I have to look carefully at how this is done in a typical Delphi approach. This, as I've said before, this is not a methodology that I typically use. So, but that's a very good point and well taken. And I think that we will have to look very closely at how we construct it up. What I'm sort of hoping is that there's some consensus, and if there's not, then we have to look more carefully at the measure itself, I think.
It will lead to consensus, right? Like, 'cause often you'll reduce a subset, or if you have that bimodality, you can kind of iterate with the group to try to come to consensus by highlighting those.
Yeah, that's certainly an approach. I think we can consider that too.
This is Bob Burhans. That's exactly the approach that was taken. We had large group meetings with a broad array of subject matter experts, and that's exactly the kind of discussion that went on after the measured detail was completed, so people could look at least the best thinking of the subject matter experts in that area, and then we would go back and review those and decide which ones were going to remain and which ones were going to be moved to another subdomain or domain, and which ones were going to be excluded because it just didn't, the group consensus was that it was not a good measure after we went through that process. So I think the Delphi approach can do the same thing, but I think you're right. That group process can be very important, where you have either divergent views or where people are ranking everything in the middle because they're not confident of what score they should give it. So that's the process that was used in the past, and I think there's some value.
Yeah, one of the advantages of the Delphi approach is that it'll be anonymous, and one of the reasons that Delphi approaches use that anonymity, or at least it'll be anonymous to the other group members, is that prevents there's always, when you get into a meeting in a room and there's a group dynamic and leaders emerge that tend to drive things, and so we're looking to get away from that with the Delphi approach. And so I think that's but I think we do know we do have the input from the original construction of the index, and it's it's a great set of information to start with. So I think we're just working on refining this. Can we go back to the next slide there, Mike? So Mike and Glenn and I have talked, and like I said, sort of in an ideal world, we might actually begin with a Delphi group for each subdomain, but in doing the math, you want the members of any Delphi group, you want the number to be high enough that there's at least some sort of statistical meaning to the any average or whatever that you bring out of that. Not necessarily like 30, but more than 3. And so what we sort of had envisioned was 6 groups, one for each domain, one set of experts for each domain, and that they would then evaluate all the measures in that domain as a part of each subgroup. So I think Mike, do we have the domains and subdomains? Yeah, great. So for example, in the health security surveillance, we would get a group of experts together and have them evaluate the 34 measures in the domain. The first 11 as a part of the subdomain health surveillance and epidemiological investigation. and the second is the next 23 is a subset of biological monitoring and laboratory testing. The concern, of course, is that that's so many measures. You know, and some of the other ones, the healthcare delivery has even more. I think what there's, Mike, are there 60 some measures in that domain?
Let's see here. There are 55 measures in the healthcare delivery domain.
Right, which is a lot to ask. And so if anyone has any sort of thoughts, is that too much to ask a Delphi panel, or is that, or do you think that would be okay?
This is Glenn. In my experience, we're just wrapping up another Delphi panel actually for developing a research agenda for the foundation around culture of health. And in our last iteration, we had nominated over 100 individual, research priority topics. And we were able to go through those, and we did 3 iterations to try to move to consensus. And we were able to move with an online panel, move through that pretty expeditiously. So I think, those numbers are reasonable for Delphi.
Other thoughts? Okay. And then in the next stage, we would move to weighting the subdomains. So here again, we'd stick with our 6 domain groups, each group focusing on weighting the subdomains up to that domain. And so, for example, in the health security, there's only 2 subdomains, and we would give them a proportion or a percentage so that they were explicitly then measuring the percentage weight that goes in. So that's a little bit different than what we asked him to do in the first one, which is to rate its sort of importance in that. And then this one, we'll ask them to actually give specific weights that we would then again use some kind of median or mean to come up with final weighting. And then we would come back to them, and to be clear here, at each stage when we come back, we'll be providing them with the list of results that we have come up with from the prior stages. So for example, when they're weighting the subdomains, we're going to have told them, okay, based on that, here are the measures in this subdomain, and here are the weights that we're assigning them based on the Delphi approach. And I think we're also probably going to be including some of the item to scale analysis results that we've arrived at as well, so that we're using sort of all the information we have together. And then we'll ask them, give us a proportion moving up to the domain, and then Mike, if you can give me the next slide, and then we'll come back to them again saying, okay, here are all the proportions within each domain from the subdomains, and we'll ask them to give us percentages on how the domains should be weighted up to the final index. And I think, and then at this point we may change the groups to be a smaller group, and it'll be just one group then. So we'll use the separate domain subgroups for everything from the measures and the subdomains, and then one consolidated group for the domain.
Yeah, this is Bob.
I think that's good, and I think it's going to be important that who's on that final group. I mean, one of the things, just from being, I used to divvy the money up in a grant to divisions that represented many of these individual domains. And if you were to ask a laboratorian about how important the laboratories are in that domain that's health security surveillance, they would say it's the most important aspect of that domain. But if you were to ask the same thing of a communicable disease epidemiologist or someone who was doing that kind of work out in the local health department, they would weight it quite differently. So, and I think you get to the point where you're going to be making that overall call about percentages of the contributing of the domains to the whole. I think the selection of that group is going to be very important because you're going to need somebody that has an overall perspective, not just a piecemeal approach to preparedness.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Bob. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So this is Jim. I was just going to add and kind of reiterate a little bit about what Bob said. I think it's very, very important that we get the right group at the end. But also during the process, will we do some type of evaluation of what the impacts of any of these proposed changes would look like against the indexes of the past?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing that with every proposed change at every stage. Mike and Dominique have been running, correlations and all that. I mean, one of the sort of surprising and maybe not surprising and comforting things is that you can twist and push this around quite a bit, and it does maintain its original correlation with a pretty high correlation with the sort of original all everything index, and so I think there's some good news in that it means we can look very carefully at components and think about parsimony without think carefully about parsimony here. I think I agree with you. It'll be important to have a broadly diverse group, I think, looking at this, and that prevents, Bob's concern about, well, the group who are in the, pre-hospital care are always going to think that's the most important thing. And but I think also, one of the things that I see is often the case when you ask experts their opinion, they're often aware of what's going on in other areas and how importantly that can fit into the overall picture. And I think in particular in an anonymous setting, they may be more inclined to sort of take a broader view because they're not seen as giving up the ship or whatever, right? I mean, I can certainly tell you in budget meetings at universities, and I'm pretty sure this is probably true for any of you who work in government as well, that when you're in the budget meeting, your area is, by God, the most important thing going on in the whole world. But when you get those people aside in the bar over beer, they'll tell you, yeah, we really need to shore up this or that, but they don't want to do that in public. So I think the Delphi approach, with its inherent anonymity in the scoring, allows people to be a little bit more honest about how they really see the world.
Chris, this is James from Rhode Island, and the other comment that I have about the Delphi questions is I think we need to be cognizant of the frame in which we're asking the questions. So as I looked through them, we use it in terms of the relevance for preparedness, and I'm wondering if we need to pick, maybe 3 to 5 frames that we would want to ask that same question, because I could envision from an all hazards perspective that the all hazards score for response is different than the all hazards score for recovery, which is different than the overall potential preparedness and the overall either health security or health resilience aspect. So I think not only those definitions, but asking that question in different ways may be insightful.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, James. Let me think about that one. I haven't given much thought. So you're really suggesting asking it different ways across the group?
Yeah, because I'm thinking, there are indicators in there that are certainly critical to response, but may have no weight on recovery, so therefore their rating in overall for preparedness may be altered by that.
Okay.
And so I think that, I don't know if you want to look at the mission areas from FEMA in terms of asking the question in terms of its relevance, but I also could see like you could actually have different layers of or viewing of the scores long term based on a weighting inherent to, are we talking about response versus recovery versus mitigation?
Okay.
Because I don't know if, and maybe you can deal with this separately in terms of asking a panel to look across the frameworks that we're developing and that are going into the model group to say, in terms of influencers on preparedness or health security preparedness or resilience, how much do each of these pieces weigh in on that, or are they equal? Because I don't know that anybody's answered that question.
Okay. No, that's a good idea. That's a way of framing it that I hadn't been thinking about. So we'll take a look at that.
Right, because preparedness, inherently, are we talking public health preparedness, health security preparedness, public health preparedness, especially knowing that you're going to engage stakeholders from different aspects, and we want it to be overall.
Right.
I think everybody needs to be grading it based on a common framework, but I don't think we've asked whether or not certain indicators or certain areas have an inherently different amount of importance based on the different frameworks out there. So, just consideration.
That sort of also, I think, fits in some with what Kathy Slump has written in the chat box, which you might want to take a look at. And I think that's also a good point, which is to give them a framing of how we how this was arrived at. And Kathy, if I'm not summarizing what you wrote correctly, I apologize. But to provide the panelists with a listed rationale for the original measures and some framing as well, and that I think, James, both you and Kathy, those are good points, and I think how we phrase it and how we construct it is something we should definitely put some time into considering. I believe so. I think our next steps are going to be then taking this basic framework and fleshing it out into an actual set of questionnaires and with the framing. These are some really good ideas, and I appreciate your input. And we'll try to put that together and get that out to you here in the next month or so. Does that seem reasonable, Mike?
Yes, it does. We want to move on this quickly because the information on the first wave regarding the sort of the inherent ranking and actually it's explicit ranking of the item measures, we can use into the process of trying to decide, which measures do experts think are the most important. One of the questions that we would like to include on this is please identify any item measures that are core or cross-cutting or transcendent. If a subdomain has 11 measures or 13 measures? Can you, well, we can. Once the experts go through this, we'll be able to see, hopefully we'll be able to see some convergence on which of the 11 or 13 or whatever the number is, which of these measures appear to be the most important measures. And we want to use that input to augment the statistical analysis that we have been doing and that is ongoing. It's important, obviously, to get this substantive input, which leads me to this question. Who are the experts for each of these 6 domains that should constitute these Delphi panels, and who are the experts who should constitute the big panel, the people who have the 35,000-foot perspective, who should participate on the final panel? You don't have to tell us now, but please give some thought to it, and send it to us on email, or call me, or whatever works for you, because and maybe you have specific individuals, maybe you have professional associations who we should contact. Just throw your ideas at me, and we'll get this stuff together, and we'll iterate on it. But I'm eager to move this along.
And this is Glenn. Well, just so you know as well, we're also be tapping on the expertise of members of our other work groups, and especially members of our National Advisory Committee, and in making nominations for this panel. Most likely, because of the role that our National Advisory Committee is playing in the overall scientific guidance for the index, most likely many of those members will want to tap to be part of this Delphi process. I mean, that's why we went through the arduous iterative process of nominating those 14 individuals. But we'll need larger breadth and depth as well. So we'll tap your expertise, work group members. We'll tap the expertise of our other work group members as well to make sure we assemble a well-balanced Delphi, but from both breadth and depth of expertise.
I think a good place to start would be looking at the sources for which the measures come from, because I think the folks who are experts about them are asking those questions and gathering that data for very specific reasons, and probably know it better than even some of us who use it do. So they may be a good start, especially since some of it comes from national and umbrella organizations. But yes, that inherently puts some bias in terms of looking at the measures, but I think they know them best and can say, yeah, it really applies here, but maybe it doesn't apply so much in a different case. So I would say that's a place.
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe what we should do is put together a sort of a questionnaire that we send out to the members of this panel and elsewhere. Mike?
Questionnaire that would pose this question about who?
Yeah. All right. I think the last slide is just a reminder that the model design group will meet June 16th, which is next week. Anything else, Mike, Glenn?
I don't think so. This is great work.
Anyone else have any thoughts? Anything they would like to bring? All right. Listen, thank you all very much for taking time out of your day. I appreciate it. We got some very good points here, some very good thoughts that'll help us move forward on this. I appreciate all of your time and all of your input. I hope you have a great week and a nice summer.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.